Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Atheniano Show. In 2024, there are approximately 64 national elections taking place. As far as I remember, that is an historic event. So, to commemorate and to better help you guys understand these elections, I thought a good idea would be to give a brief overview of each election before they happen, or at least try to do it before they happen, in order to help you guys better follow the results if you are interested. So, first up on the list is Panama, and they are holding a general election, which includes both president and parliament, on May 5th. So, let's begin. So, I'm just going to be doing the president. The four main presidential candidates, although there are more, are Raul Mulino, Romulo Ru, Ricardo Lambana, and Jose Carrizo. Now, traditionally in Panama, there has been three main parties. The first has been the Democratic Revolutionary Party, or PRD, second, Panamista, or PPA, and then the third, Democratic Change, CD. Now, all of them ideologically are very similar. They all tend to be center-right on the spectrum, very close, and they don't differ that much. So this kind of means that Panama's politics are not very polarized or ideologically driven. But this does not mean that Panama itself, obviously, is very ideologically similar. In fact, it's quite possible that a lot of the differences in views of Panamanian citizens gets hidden by the fact that the main ruling parties have been traditionally very, very similar. But this election, you do have two of those three main parties running for election, but you also have two new parties that are running. And interestingly enough, one of those new parties, Realizing Goals, has the front-runner candidate, Raul Mulino. So he is the front-runner. He is polling at about 30%, pretty consistently. And then you have Ricardo Lambana from Another Way movement. Now, Ricardo Lambana ran last election, so elections in Panama are 5 years each. So he ran from in the 2019 election, and as an independent candidate, and he came in third. And he's actually he's polling quite high, around second. Distant from Molino, but still roughly in second. Now, I think in large part the reason for this change in candidates that are not part of the big three are in 2014 they introduced a law in Panama that you could run as an independent candidate. And so obviously Ricardo Lambana took advantage of this in 2019 and ran as an independent. And so I think that kind of helped open the door for independent candidates. But that's also, remember I said there's a president and a parliamentary election happening in Panama. So even if the presidential election has kind of had more variety or new parties, the parliament is still very much driven by the three main parties, particularly PRD, which is the largest party. And currently the president in power, Laurentino Cortizo, is part of the Democratic Revolutionary Party, although he is extremely unpopular. I think his approval rating is roughly around 11%, 11 or 10%. So it's unlikely that his counterpart, Jose Carrizo of the Democratic Revolutionary Party, is going to win. So in terms of the way Panama presidential elections work, a couple of things to note. Number one, it is a first-past-the-post system, which for those of you who don't know what it means, roughly it means that whoever has the most votes or the highest percentage of votes wins all of the election, gains all of the control, regardless of what, number one, what percentage of the votes they get. So they could win theoretically with like 25%. Number two, it does not matter how much of their victory they get. So they could get 25% and the second person could get 24.5%, but the person with 25% automatically gets all the votes. And there was no second round. There's no second round in Panama. The other thing to note is that in Panama, you cannot run for re-election immediately. So the current president, Laurentino Cortizo, who was president from 2019 to 2024, cannot run constitutionally in the 2024 election. Now, this does not mean that you can't run ever. So it's actually possible that you can run in multiple times in non-consecutive elections. So you could run from 2024 to 2029, and then again in 2034 to 2039, but not from 2024 to 2029, and then from 2029 to 2034. I think that's relatively easy to understand. So a couple more things. Panama generally is an economic success story. They have the largest GDP per capita in Latin America, although they also have the third largest inequality in Latin America. But going back to their economic success, they have roughly, it's $29,000 per person in Panama per capita on the GDP. And so to give you an idea of where that is, that's roughly equal to Greece and Latvia. And again, that's the largest in Latin America. Now, a large part of this economic success story, or their economic growth, is driven by the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal roughly has about 5% of the world's trade, and Panama got control of the canal in the 90s, and since then they've seen pretty much economic growth each year. Importantly, though, the exception to that was in 2020 during COVID, when they experienced steep economic decline. And that was obviously during the current president's reign, so I think that contributes to his unpopularity. But according to most polls, the number one issue among the Panamanian people is corruption. They care about corruption the most. And generally, they perceive high levels of corruption in the Panamanian government, and as a result, they have very low trust, or the trust in Panamanians' democratic institutions has been declining relatively rapidly and steadily. I know that's kind of a contradiction, but it's gone down steadily. So the second thing you need to know about Panama from a political perspective is in 2022 and 2023, there was massive protests over a deal that the government signed with a Canadian copper industry to give them access to what would be the largest copper mine in Central America. And there was huge protest from environmental groups over that mine, because they believed that opening the mine would harm the environment and do damage. And part of it also ties into the fact that, again, they perceive the government as corrupt. So they felt like it was evidence of a corrupt action. So there was massive waves of protest, and eventually the government caved and ended up closing the mine and scrapping the deal. Now, on the flip side of that, that mine deal would have accounted for roughly 5% of Panama's total GDP. And also closing the mine has lowered Panama's capacity for foreign direct investment, which generally plays a big part in their economy. So there is a flip side to that. There's the environment and, caring about local people's country and nature and etc. And then there's also economic growth. But as I mentioned, corruption and inequality is a big factor is a big part of Panamanian society. So if you think about it, if economic growth doesn't really mean more money in people's pockets, then that's not really relevant to their thinking about opening up this coal mine. Sorry, this copper mine. So, okay. Now let's I think you have a general good idea of where Panama is as a country background. Okay, so now let's turn to the candidates themselves, mainly the frontrunner, Raul Mulino. So, Raul Mulino was initially the vice president for Ricardo Martinelli, and he is the one that founded this party, Realizing Goals. He also was the head of Democratic Change in 2009, when he was president, but he left the party later and founded Realizing Goals. So, as I mentioned, Mulino was a VP for Martinelli, and Martinelli was the president from 2009 to 2014, and it was during this period that Panama experienced very steady and consistent large economic growth. That's important because as a result of the steady economic growth, Martinelli his presidency is seen with high favorability among Panamanians. Again, this is all relative, but relative to other candidates and other presidencies, Martinelli is generally seen very favorably because of the economic growth. And it is for this reason that he's still very popular. So initially, Martinelli was running for president under Realizing Goals, and he was the front runner. But he was convicted of money laundering charges and was deemed unable to run. Currently, he's in the Nicaraguan embassy in Panama, escaping arrest, I guess. And so Mulino is running in his place. Now, Mulino was the security minister under Martinelli in 2009, and generally he was known for being a repressive figure. He suppressed a protest that killed 2 and injured many others. But he's generally kind of seen as a sidekick of Martinelli. He doesn't really have many specific policies, and he hasn't appeared in televised debates, and he doesn't do many interviews, but roughly his policies are, he says he's going to bring economic growth, the same that Martinelli did, 2009 to 2014. He says he's going to be tough on crime and stabilize the country. He says he's going to close the Darien Gap, which is the gap that many migrants go through in Panama. And he says he's going to free Martinelli. So, yeah, that's pretty much his policy. He hasn't said much about how he's going to facilitate economic growth, but he says he's going to do it, like Martinelli did in 2009 to 2014. Now, it's very unlikely, that he's going to be able to repeat that economic success that Martinelli had in 2009 to 2014, because that economic growth was largely predicated on the work that the previous president, that administration did when they expanded the Panama Canal. So Martinelli's economic growth was largely piggybacking off the completion of the expansion of the Panama Canal that was done by the previous administration. So that was really the reason that Martinelli experienced economic growth during that period, not specific policies that he did. So it's going to be very hard for Mulino, if he becomes elected, to repeat that, especially considering it seems like he doesn't really have many policies in mind. But so yes, the reason he's popular is, number one, associated with Martinelli, and number two, as I mentioned, very low trust in institutions, generally high levels of perceived corruption in the government, and because of this, Martinelli, but also Mulino, is kind of seen as like a stick to the man candidate, or for lack of a better word, fuck you candidate. Because Martinelli is being prosecuted by the establishment, voting for the guy that's being, or establishment, by the current government, because he's being prosecuted by the current government, and the current government is very unpopular, and particularly the party, it's kind of like, we're sticking it to you by voting for the guy that you've imprisoned, even if, number one, he is corrupt, Martinelli, I mean, and number two, he really did do money laundering and deserves to be arrested. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Mulino will likely win, again, because he's associated with Martinelli, and because it's kind of like a fuck you to the system. Unlikely that economic growth will happen under Mulino, but it's possible. We'll see. But yeah, I hope that makes you a little bit more informed about the Panama election. If you're interested, if you don't care at all, well, then I don't know if you'll find this video interesting. But if you do care and are interested, hopefully you got something out of this. And if you're from Panama and have more insight, please criticize me in the chat. Tell me what I left out. Tell me what I need to add. Tell me what I got wrong. And I would gladly learn from you. Again, I'm an outsider. I was just doing research, trying to get the best I could. But hearing it from a local is always the best way. So please, if you're from Panama, you hear this video and you have insights, share them in the chat. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The next election is Chad on May 6th. They do have 2 rounds, and the second round would be in either June or July, I don't remember. So I may not do the Chad video now. And I may go to the Northern Macedonian, which is on May 8th. So that will be the next one. So yeah, hopefully you got something out of this. Hopefully it means something to you. Hopefully it wasn't too long and convoluted. I'll get better as the year goes on. But yeah, thank you guys so much for listening. Subscribe if you got something out of this video and you want to stay tuned for the other elections. And see you next time. Bye-bye.